This is the day Venezuela entered history. Let me tell you about July 28, 2024, a date that will be studied in geopolitics courses for decades, though most people won't realize its significance until it's too late. On that day, Nicolas Maduro was declared the winner of Venezuela's presidential election, securing 51% of the vote according to the country's electoral council. The mainstream narrative? A flawed but legitimate election, another chapter in Venezuela's long descent into authoritarianism, a predictable outcome that changes little. The U.S. State Department called it neither free nor fair. The EU expressed serious concerns. The media ran the usual Venezuela's dictator clings to power, Maduro defies international pressure, another blow to democracy in Latin America. But here's what they're not telling: this wasn't just another election. This was the moment Venezuela ceased to be a mere domestic crisis and became the front line of a new global conflict, one that could reshape the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere and beyond. And if you think this is just about Venezuela, you're missing the forest for the trees. I've spent the last 30 years studying the intersection of resource politics, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of American hegemony. I've advised governments, written classified briefs, and watched as the same patterns repeat themselves each time with higher stakes. What's happening in Venezuela right now isn't just about Maduro, or socialism, or even oil. It's about the end of an era, and the violent birth of something new. And if we don't understand that, we're sleepwalking into a crisis we're not prepared for. The official what they want you to believe. Let's start with the story we're being fed. On July 28, Venezuela held its presidential election. The opposition, led by Edmundo González and backed by Maria Corina Machado, claimed victory based on exit polls and their own tally of voting receipts. The government, meanwhile, declared Maduro the winner with 51.2% of the vote, a margin of just over 300,000 votes out of nearly 12 million cast. The National Electoral Council, which is controlled by Maduro's allies, certified the results. The opposition cried fraud, the US and its allies denounced the process as illegitimate, and the world moved on. Another day, another dictatorship thumbing its nose at democracy. The numbers seem to support the skepticism. Venezuela's economy is in shambles, GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013, inflation has hit 1 million% at its peak, and over 7 million people have fled the country. Maduro's approval rating hovers around 20%. The opposition, for all its flaws, had momentum. Polls before the election showed González leading by as much as 30 points. Even the CNE's own quick count, leaked to the press, reportedly showed González ahead. So when Maduro was declared the winner, it didn't just defy expectations, it defied logic. The U.S. response was swift. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called the election deeply flawed, and the Biden administration refused to recognize the results. The EU joined in, as did most of Latin America's democracies. The narrative was Maduro had stolen the election, and the international community would not stand for it. Sanctions, already crippling, would be tightened. Diplomatic pressure would intensify. The message was that Venezuela's regime was on borrowed time. But there's a problem with this narrative. It assumes that this is still 2019, that the world is the same as it was when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president and the US recognized him as Venezuela's legitimate leader. It assumes that the rules of the game haven't changed. And most dangerously, it assumes that Maduro is the same desperate dictator he was 5 years ago, clinging to power by his fingernails. That's not who he is anymore. And that's not what this election was about. The hidden facts behind the headlines. Let's start with the most obvious. If Maduro was so unpopular, why did he risk holding an election at all? The answer is simple: he didn't. Not really. This wasn't an election in the sense that we understand the term. It was a performance, a carefully choreographed piece of political theater designed to achieve three: consolidate power domestically, divide the opposition, and most importantly, send a message to the world that Venezuela is no longer a U.S. client state. First, the domestic angle. Maduro's regime has spent the last decade dismantling Venezuela's democratic institutions. The opposition has been systematically excluded, jailed, or exiled. The CNE is a rubber stamp body. The judiciary is a tool of the state. The military, which controls key sectors of the economy, has been bought off with lucrative contracts and immunity from prosecution. In this context, an election isn't about winning, it's about legitimizing the illusion of consent. Maduro didn't need to win by a landslide. He just needed to win by enough to claim a mandate, while ensuring that the opposition couldn't credibly claim fraud without appearing to reject the very idea of elections altogether. Which brings us to the opposition. The fact that they participated at all was a victory for Maduro. For years, the opposition has been divided between those who wanted to boycott elections and those who believed that engaging was the only way to build a credible alternative. This time, the participationists won. And Maduro let them. He allowed Machado to campaign, he permitted Gonzales to run, and he even let opposition observers monitor the vote. Why? Because he knew that no matter what happened, he could control the outcome. And when the results came in, he knew the opposition would cry foul, but that their complaints would lack the moral authority of a full boycott. But here's where it gets interesting. The opposition did have a case. Their tally of voting receipts showed Gonzales winning by a wide margin. The CNE's own quick count reportedly showed the same. So why did the official results show Maduro winning? The most plausible explanation is that the regime engaged in what's known as electoral alchemy, manipulating the vote count at the margins to ensure a narrow victory. Not enough to trigger a mass uprising, but enough to claim a mandate. And crucially, enough to force the opposition into a no-win, either accept the results or reject them. This brings us to the third, and most important, the geopolitical message. Maduro didn't just steal an election, he stole it with the backing of powers that have a vested interest in seeing the US humiliated in its own backyard. And that changes everything. Let me tell you something that most analysts won't say: this election wasn't just about Venezuela. It was a test. A test of how far the US is willing to go to defend its sphere of influence in Latin America. A test of whether the rules-based international order still has teeth. And most importantly, a test of whether the US is still capable of enforcing those rules when its adversaries have the means to push back. The data doesn't support the idea that this was just another Maduro power grab. For one thing, the regime has been strengthening its position over the past 2 years. In 2023, Maduro reached a deal with the US to ease sanctions in exchange for allowing free and fair elections. The US lifted some restrictions on Venezuela's oil sector, and Maduro released political prisoners and allowed the opposition to participate. But when the election results came in, the US immediately reimposed sanctions, calling the vote a sham. Maduro's response? He doubled down. He expelled US diplomats, threatened to seize American assets in Venezuela, and most significantly announced a new military alliance with Russia and Iran. This wasn't the behavior of a regime on the brink. This was the behavior of a regime that knew it had backup. And that's the key. What's really happening in Venezuela isn't just about Maduro. It's about the fact that Venezuela is now a proxy in a much larger game, one where the US, Russia, and China are competing for influence in a region that Washington has long considered its exclusive domain. And Maduro, for all his flaws, has become a useful idiot for powers that want to see the US bleed. The X did geopolitical Venezuela as the new Berlin. To understand why this election matters, you have to way out. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the end of the unipolar moment, the period after the Cold War when the US was the world's sole superpower, able to dictate terms to the rest of the planet. That era is over. What we're seeing now is the emergence of a multipolar world, where power is diffused among multiple centers: Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and increasingly, regional players like Iran, Turkey, and India. And in this new world, Venezuela is the perfect battleground. Let's start with the oil. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, more than Saudi Arabia. For decades, that oil flowed north to the US, which treated Venezuela as a de facto client state. But after Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999, that relationship soured. Chavez nationalized the oil industry, kicked out US commies, and aligned Venezuela with Cuba, Iran, and later Russia. The US responded with sanctions, which crippled Venezuela's economy but failed to dislodge the regime. And now, with the US trying to wean itself off Middle Eastern oil, Venezuela's reserves are more valuable than ever. But it's not just about oil. It's about control. Latin America has been the US's backyard since the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. The idea that another great power could establish a foothold in the Western Hemisphere is Washington's worst nightmare. And yet, that's exactly what's happening. Russia has been Venezuela's most visible ally. Since 2006, Moscow has poured billions into Venezuela's oil sector, providing loans, weapons, and political support. In 2019, Russia sent troops to Venezuela to prop up Maduro during the Guaidó crisis. In 2023, it announced plans to build a military base in the country. And in the wake of the 2024 election, Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, was the first to congratulate Maduro, calling the election transparent and democratic. This wasn't just diplomatic nicety. It was a Russia is in Venezuela to stay. Then there's China. Beijing has been more subtle, but no less significant. China is Venezuela's largest creditor, having loaned the country over $60 billion since 2007. Most of that money was repaid in oil, which China has been happy to take at a discount. But China's real interest in Venezuela isn't just economic, it's strategic. As the US pivots to Asia, China is looking to secure its own backyard in Latin America. And Venezuela, with its oil and its anti-American government, is the perfect partner. Iran, too, has been deepening its ties with Caracas. In 2020, Iran sent tankers of gasoline to Venezuela to break the US oil embargo. In 2022, the two countries signed a 20-year cooperation agreement. And in 2024, Iran announced plans to build a drone factory in Venezuela. This isn't just about solidarity among rogue states. It's about creating a network of alliances that can challenge US dominance in the region. Now, let's talk about the US response. For years, Washington's policy toward Venezuela has been a mix of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and half-hearted regime change efforts. The problem? None of it has worked. Sanctions have hurt the Venezuelan people, but they've done little to weaken Maduro. The 2019 coup attempt failed. The 2020 naval blockade was a fiasco. And the 2023 sanctions relief deal collapsed when Maduro refused to play ball. Why? Because the US is still operating under the assumption that it can dictate outcomes in Latin America the way it did in the 20th century. But the world has changed. The US is no longer the only game in town. And Maduro, for all his flaws, has figured out how to play the great powers off against each other. Here's the real Maduro isn't just a dictator. He's a survivor. And in the new multipolar world, survival means aligning with the US's adversaries. Russia gets a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. China gets access to oil. Iran gets a partner in its proxy war against the US. And Maduro? He gets to stay in power. This is the new Cold War. And Venezuela is the new Berlin. Military and strategic, the powder keg in America's backyard. Let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get dangerous. The US has a long history of military intervention in Latin America: Guatemala in 1954, Cuba in 1961, Chile in 1973, Grenada in 1983, MA in 1989. The list goes on. And for decades, the US has treated Venezuela as a potential target. In 2019, then National Security Advisor John Bolton openly mused about a military option. In 2020, the US deployed warships to the Caribbean in a show of force. And in 2023, the Pentagon drew up contingency plans for a potential intervention. But here's the Venezuela in 2024 is not Grenada in 1983. It's not even AMA in 1989. Venezuela has a population of 28 million, a standing army of 120,000, and a stockpile of Russian and Iranian weapons. It has a network of paramilitary groups, known as colectivos, that act as the regime's enforcers. And most importantly, it has the backing of Russia and Iran, two powers that have shown they're willing to escalate when their allies are threatened. Let's break this down. Venezuela's military is one of the most well-equipped in Latin America. It has Russian Su-30 fighter jets, S-300 air defense systems, and T-72 tanks. It has Iranian drones and Chinese radar systems. And it has a navy that, while outdated, is capable of harassing U.S. ships in the Caribbean. In 2020, Venezuela conducted joint military exercises with Russia and Iran, exercises that were clearly designed to send a message to the U.S. Now, could the U.S. defeat Venezuela in a conventional war? Absolutely. The U.S. military is the most powerful in the world, and Venezuela's forces are no match for it. But that's not the point is that a war with Venezuela wouldn't be a quick, clean operation like Grenada or AMA. It would be a messy, protracted conflict, one that could easily spiral out of control. Here's why. First, Venezuela has asymmetric capabilities. It has Iranian-made drones that could target U.S. bases in the region. It has Russian anti-ship missiles that could threaten U.S. naval assets. And it has a network of paramilitary groups that could wage a guerrilla war against U.S. forces. Second, Venezuela has allies that are willing to escalate. Russia has already warned that any U.S. intervention in Venezuela would be met with a forceful response. Iran has said the same. And China, while more cautious, has made it clear that it opposes any foreign interference in Venezuela's internal affairs. This is the lesson of Iraq, Afghanistan, and the U.S. can win the initial battle, but it can't win the war. And in Venezuela, the stakes are even higher. A U.S. intervention would trigger a regional crisis. It would push Cuba, Nicaragua, and Bolivia closer to Russia and China. It would destabilize Colombia, which is already dealing with a resurgent guerrilla movement. And it would send a message to the rest of Latin: the U.S. is still willing to use force to get its way. That's a message the U.S. can't afford to send. Not when its adversaries are watching. Not when its allies are questioning its commitment to diplomacy. And not when its own people are tired of endless wars. But here's the U.S. doesn't need to invade Venezuela to lose. It's already losing. Every time it imposes sanctions that don't work, every time it backs a coup that fails, every time it issues empty threats, it looks weaker. And in the new multipolar world, weakness is an invitation to aggression. The domestic political why the U.S. can't walk away. Now, let's talk about the domestic politics of this crisis, because this is where things get really messy. The U.S. response to Venezuela isn't just about geopolitics. It's about elections. It's about swing states. It's about the fact that the Biden administration is caught between a rock and a hard place, and the Republicans are loving every minute of it. Let's start with Florida. Florida is the most important swing state in the U.S., and it's home to over 1.5 million Venezuelan Americans. Many of them fled Maduro's regime, and they hate him with a passion. They want the U.S. to take a hard line on Venezuela. They want sanctions. They want regime change. And they vote. In 2020, Biden won Florida by just 37,000 votes. In 2024, he can't afford to lose it. But here's the Venezuelan American community is divided. Some want a tougher stance on Maduro. Others, particularly younger voters, are more skeptical of U.S. intervention. They remember Iraq. They remember Libya. They don't want another war. And they're not convinced that sanctions are the answer. This puts the Biden administration in a bind. If it takes a hard line on Venezuela, it risks alienating progressive voters. If it takes a softer line, it risks losing Florida. And if it does nothing, it looks weak. Then there's the Republican angle. The GOP has been hammering Biden on Venezuela for years. They've accused him of being soft on Maduro. Now, what most people don't realize is that the Republican strategy on Venezuela isn't just about scoring political points, it's about reshaping the entire narrative around American power. When Marco Rubio stands in front of a camera and accuses Biden of abandoning Venezuelan democracy, he's not just talking to Florida voters. He's talking to the global audience that still looks to the U.S. for leadership, even if that leadership is increasingly unreliable. And here's the uncomfortable: Rubio isn't wrong about the optics. The Biden administration's Venezuela policy has been a masterclass in how not to project strength. Let me explain why this matters beyond the ballot box. The US has spent the last 2 decades trying to convince the world that it can be both a superpower and a responsible global citizen. But Venezuela has exposed the lie at the heart of that proposition. The sanctions regime, which the US has maintained since 2017, was supposed to be a smart alternative to military intervention, a way to squeeze Maduro without firing a shot. Instead, it's become a case study in the law of unintended consequences. The Venezuelan economy has contracted by over 75% since 2013, but Maduro is still in power. The sanctions have starved the country of foreign investment, but they've also given the regime a convenient scapegoat for its own failures. And worst of all, they've pushed Venezuela straight into the arms of Russia, China, and Iran, exactly the outcome the US was trying to prevent. Here's the thing about: they only work if you're willing to enforce them with real consequences. The US has frozen Venezuelan assets, banned oil imports, and sanctioned everyone from Maduro's inner circle to the state-owned oil company PDVSA. But it hasn't been willing to do the one thing that might actually break the cut off Venezuela's access to the global financial system. Why? Because that would mean targeting the banks and companies in China, Russia, and India that keep Maduro afloat. And the US isn't ready for that kind of confrontation, not when it's already stretched thin by Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East. Now, let's talk about the military angle, because this is where the Venezuela crisis gets really dangerous. The US has spent years warning that Russia and China are using Venezuela as a forward operating base in the Western Hemisphere. And they're not wrong. Russia has sent military advisors, Wagner Group mercenaries, and even nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela. China has poured billions into the country's oil and mining sectors, turning it into a de facto client state. And Iran has used Venezuela as a hub for its proxy networks, including Hezbollah. But here's the part that should keep US policymakers up: none of this is happening in a vacuum. It's part of a broader strategy to erode American influence in what the US has long considered its backyard. Let me give you an example. In 2020, Russia sent two Tu-160 strategic bombers to Venezuela for a training mission. Those are the same bombers that can carry nuclear weapons. The US responded with a few strongly worded statements and some extra naval patrols in the Caribbean. That's it. No sanctions on the Russian officials involved. No diplomatic expulsions. Just business as usual. And that's the problem. The US keeps treating Venezuela like a regional nuisance, but its adversaries are treating it like a geopolitical chess piece. Every time the US blinks, Russia and China move another piece into place. Now, you might be okay, but the US has military bases all over Latin America. It's not like Venezuela is going to invade Florida. And you'd be right. But that's not the point is that Venezuela is becoming a testing ground for a new kind of hybrid warfare, one where economic coercion, disinformation, and proxy forces do the work that tanks and missiles used to do. The US has spent decades preparing for a conventional war in Europe or Asia. But it's completely unprepared for a conflict where the front lines are in cyberspace, the financial system, and the minds of voters in swing states like Florida. Here's another uncomfortable: the US military is not built for this kind of fight. The Pentagon's budget is still dominated by big-ticket items like aircraft carriers and stealth bombers. But what good is a carrier strike group when your enemy is using cryptocurrency to bypass sanctions? What good is a stealth fighter when your adversary is hacking your power grid? The US has the best military in the world for fighting wars. But it's woefully behind when it comes to winning the peace or even just maintaining influence without firing a shot. And that brings me back to the domestic politics of this crisis. The Biden administration is caught between two impossible choices. On one hand, it can double down on sanctions and risk pushing Venezuela even closer to Russia and China. On the other hand, it can ease up on the pressure and risk looking weak to both its allies and its adversaries. Neither option is good. But here's the longer the US dithers, the more it loses. Because in the new multipolar world, power isn't just about who has the biggest army. It's about who can shape the narrative, control the financial system, and convince the rest of the world that they're the ones who will still be standing when the dust settles. So where does that leave us? Right now, the US is stuck in a cycle of half measures and empty threats. It imposes sanctions but doesn't enforce them. It supports the opposition but doesn't give them the tools to win. It warns Maduro about consequences but never follows through. And every time it does this, it sends a message to the rest of the American power is a paper tiger. That's a dangerous message to send, especially when your adversaries are watching. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that weakness invites aggression. And in Venezuela, the US is showing plenty of both. Now, what most people don't realize is that this cycle of indecision isn't just a failure of policy, it's a failure of imagination. The US foreign policy establishment still operates on the assumption that Venezuela is a problem to be managed, not a crisis to be resolved. And that's a critical mistake. Because while Washington dithers, Caracas is playing a different game entirely. Maduro isn't just surviving, he's adapting. And in the process, he's rewriting the rules of what it means to be a pariah state in the 21st century. Let me explain why this matters. Take the recent elections, for instance. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado and later Edmundo Gonzalez, won in a landslide, 67% of the vote, according to their own tallies. The regime's response? To declare victory for Maduro with 51%, a number so transparently fabricated that even the Carter Center, which has monitored Venezuelan elections for decades, refused to endorse it. Now, most Western analysts would look at this and say, well, that's it. The regime has lost all legitimacy. And they'd be right. But here's the uncomfortable: legitimacy is a luxury Maduro can no longer afford, and he knows it. What he's betting on instead is something far more durable: fear. Fear is the currency of authoritarian survival. And Maduro has spent the last decade perfecting its use. The crackdowns on protesters, the arbitrary arrests, the show trials, these aren't just acts of desperation. They're calculated moves to ensure that the cost of resistance is always higher than the cost of compliance. And it's working. The opposition is fractured, exhausted, and increasingly divided between those who want to fight and those who just want to leave. Over 7 million Venezuelans have already fled the country since 2015, according to the UN. That's nearly a quarter of the population. And every time another family packs up and heads for Colombia or Peru or the US, it's one less voice demanding change back home. But here's where the domestic politics of Venezuela get really interesting. Because Maduro's survival isn't just about repression, it's about co-optation. The regime has spent years buying off key sectors of the military, the business elite, even parts of the opposition. Take the military, for example. The armed forces are the backbone of Maduro's rule, but they're not a monolith. There are factions within the military that are loyal to the regime, factions that are opportunistic, and factions that are quietly waiting for an opportunity to defect. The problem for the US is that it has no real leverage over any of them. Sanctions have hurt the economy, but they've also given the regime an excuse to blame all of Venezuela's problems on external enemies. And every time the US tightens the screws, it pushes more of those opportunistic military officers into Maduro's arms. Now, let's talk about the business elite. The so-called Boliburguesa, the Bolivarian bourgeoisie, is a class of wealthy insiders who've made fortunes by exploiting the regime's corruption. These are the people who control the import licenses, the currency exchange rates, the contracts for public works. They're not ideologues, they're pragmatists. And they're not going to risk their fortunes on a political transition unless they're absolutely sure they'll come out on top. The US has tried to target them with sanctions, but it's a blunt instrument. Freeze their assets, and they'll just move their money to AMA or Dubai. Cut them off from the dollar, and they'll trade in yuan or rubles. The regime has spent years building parallel financial systems, and they're not going to unravel overnight. Then there's the opposition itself. The problem here isn't just that they're divided, it's that they're trapped in a cycle of false hope. Every few years, the US and its allies declare that this time, the opposition will finally unseat Maduro. In 2019, it was Juan Guaidó and the interim government. In 2024, it's Edmundo Gonzalez and the unified ticket. But every time, the regime outmaneuvers them. Why? Because the opposition is still playing by the rules of a democratic game that no longer exists in Venezuela. They assume that if they win an election, the military will respect the results. They assume that if they protest, the international community will come to their aid. They assume that if they just hold on long enough, the regime will collapse under its own weight. But none of those assumptions hold true anymore. Here's the Maduro isn't just a survivor, he's a student of history. He's studied the fall of the Soviet Union, the Arab Spring, the color revolutions. And he's learned the same lesson that every other authoritarian leader has: the key to staying in power isn't winning elections or even winning wars. It's making sure that no one else can win either. That's why he's spent years dismantling Venezuela's institutions. The National Assembly? Packed with loyalists. The Supreme Court? A rubber stamp. The Electoral Council? A joke. The military? Bought, bullied, or purged. And the opposition? Left with no choice but to either play along or leave. So where does that leave us? Right now, the most likely scenario isn't a sudden collapse of the regime. It's a slow, grinding decay, what political scientists call authoritarian persistence. Maduro will continue to rule, but his rule will become increasingly brittle. The economy will stagger along, kept afloat by oil sales to China and India, by gold exports to Turkey and the UAE, by whatever sanctions loopholes the regime can exploit. The opposition will continue to fracture, with some leaders fleeing into exile and others cutting deals with the regime just to survive. The military will remain the ultimate arbiter of power, but it will also become more corrupt, more divided, and more dangerous. And the US? It will keep doing what it's always done, imposing sanctions, issuing statements, and hoping for the best. But here's the: every time the US fails to follow through on its threats, it emboldens not just Maduro, but every other authoritarian leader watching from Moscow to Tehran to Beijing. They see a superpower that talks tough but can't back it up. They see a country that's still trapped in the mindset of the 20th century, when military power was the ultimate currency of influence. And they see an opportunity. Because in the end, the real battle for Venezuela isn't just about who controls Caracas. It's about who controls the future of the Western Hemisphere. And right now, the US is losing that battle not because it lacks the power, but because it lacks the will to use it effectively. The question is, how much longer can it afford to keep pretending otherwise? Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the death of an old order and the birth of something far more dangerous. The U.S. foreign policy establishment still clings to the idea that the Western Hemisphere is its natural sphere of influence, a relic of the Monroe Doctrine, as if the 19th century never ended. But the world has moved on. China didn't get the memo. Russia didn't get the memo. And Maduro? He's not just ignoring the memo, he's burning it and using the ashes to light his cigars. Let me explain why this matters. In 2019, when the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, it was a bold move on paper. The U.S. froze billions in Venezuelan assets, imposed sweeping sanctions, and even flirted with the idea of military intervention. For a moment, it looked like regime change was inevitable. But then the cracks started to show. The Europeans wavered. The Latin American allies, like Colombia and Brazil, couldn't agree on a unified strategy. And the opposition? They fractured under the pressure, with some leaders openly criticizing Guaidó for being too cozy with Washington. By 2020, the moment had passed. Maduro was still in power, and the U.S. was left holding a bag full of failed policies and broken promises. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. has no grand strategy for Venezuela because it has no grand strategy for Latin America at all. For decades, Washington's approach to the region has been a mix of neglect, half-hearted democracy promotion, and occasional bouts of interventionism when things get too messy. The last time the U.S. had a coherent Latin America policy was during the Cold War, when the goal was keep the Soviets out. But the Cold War ended 30 years ago, and since then, the U.S. has treated Latin America like a backwater, a place to outsource migration problems, a source of cheap labor, a market for American goods, but never a priority in its own right. Meanwhile, China has been playing the long game. Since 2005, Beijing has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion, most of it secured by oil shipments. Those loans weren't just about business, they were about influence. China didn't care if Maduro was a Democrat or a dictator. It cared about access to Venezuela's oil, its gold, its rare earth minerals. And when the US imposed sanctions, China didn't flinch. It just rerouted the oil through Malaysia, India, and Singapore, using a network of shell commies and middlemen to keep the money flowing. By 2023, China was buying nearly 40% of Venezuela's oil exports, up from just 5% in 2018. That's not an accident. That's strategy. Russia, too, has been making its own moves. In 2019, when the US was pushing for regime change, Moscow sent in Wagner Group mercenaries to train Maduro's forces. It sold Venezuela advanced S-300 air defense systems, turning Caracas into a potential flashpoint for any future US military action. And it used Venezuela as a testing ground for its own hybrid warfare tactics, disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, and economic sabotage. The message was if the US wants to play hardball in Venezuela, it's going to have to deal with Russia first. So what are the alternatives? The first option is the one the US seems most comfortable doubling down on: sanctions and hoping for the best. But sanctions alone won't work. They never do. Look at Cuba, Iran, North Korea, all of them have been under US sanctions for decades, and none of them have collapsed. In fact, sanctions often have the opposite effect. They strengthen the regime by giving it an external enemy to rally against. They hurt the population more than the elites, who always find ways to profit from the black market. And they push the target country into the arms of other great powers, China, Russia, Iran, who are more than happy to step in and fill the void. The second option is negotiation. The Biden administration has already tried this, offering Maduro a partial lifting of sanctions in exchange for free and fair elections. But here's the: Maduro doesn't want free and fair elections. He wants legitimacy without accountability. He wants the sanctions lifted so he can keep looting the country, but he has no intention of giving up power. Any deal that doesn't include a clear path to his exit is just a way for him to buy time. And time is the one thing he has plenty of. The third option is the one no one in Washington wants to talk: containment. If the US can't remove Maduro, it can at least limit his ability to spread instability. That means working with allies like Colombia and Brazil to secure their borders, cutting off the flow of Venezuelan gold and oil to illicit markets, and countering Russian and Chinese influence in the region. It means accepting that Venezuela is lost, for now, and focusing on preventing the crisis from spilling over into the rest of Latin America. It's not a perfect solution, but it's better than the failed state in the Western Hemisphere, armed with Russian missiles and bankrolled by Chinese loans, serving as a base for criminal networks, drug traffickers, and foreign mercenaries. But containment only works if the US is willing to commit to it for the long haul. And that's the real problem. The US foreign policy establishment is addicted to quick fixes: regime change, sanctions, military interventions. It doesn't do long-term strategy. It doesn't do patience. And it certainly doesn't do humility. The idea that the US might have to accept a loss in Venezuela, even a temporary one, is unthinkable to the people who still believe in American exceptionalism. But the world has changed. The US is no longer the sole superpower. It's one of several great powers, all of them competing for influence in a multipolar world. And if it doesn't adapt, it's going to keep losing. So where does that leave us? Right now, Venezuela is a cautionary tale. It's a warning of what happens when a country abandons its institutions, when it turns its back on democracy, when it becomes a playground for foreign powers. But it's also a test. A test of whether the US can still lead in its own hemisphere. A test of whether it can craft a strategy that's more than just sanctions and empty rhetoric. A test of whether it can accept that the world has moved on and that it needs to move on too. I've spent my career studying the rise and fall of great powers. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's the empires that last are the ones that adapt. The ones that cling to the past, that refuse to change, that insist on fighting the last war, they're the ones that collapse. The US is at a crossroads. It can keep pretending that Venezuela is just another crisis to be managed, another problem to be solved with a few more sanctions and a few more statements. Or it can wake up and realize that this is bigger than Maduro. This is about the future of the Western Hemisphere. This is about whether the US still has a role to play in the world or whether it's content to watch from the sidelines as others write the next chapter of history. The day Venezuela entered history wasn't just about one man seizing power. It was about the moment the old order died and a new one began. The question is, what comes next? And more importantly, who gets to decide?